Greetings, it is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! It is time to continue my discussion on the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons 5th Ed D&D. Well, we've been talking about game mastering, dungeon mastering, and we've also been talking about material from the Dungeon Master's Guide. So today, for you, we're going to talk about combat. Now, the fact is, we talked about combat. We did. When I handled the Player's Handbook, I went over pretty much everything you need to know about combat. What today is all about, and what a couple of days are going to be about, is you, as the DM, running a combat. So let's start with initiative. Because initiative order is a very important thing, and you're going to have to keep track of it. There are a number of ways that you, as a Dungeon Master, can keep track of initiative within combat. First and foremost, hidden initiative. Hidden initiative means that every player rolls their initiative, you roll for all the monsters, you put it on a list from a descending order, and you have it behind the Dungeon Master's screen. It means when it's everyone's turn, you basically shout out to them. It's like, hey, it's your turn. Hey, it's your turn. Hey, it's your turn. So the advantage of this is, of course, if I have hidden monsters, I can easily throw them onto the initiative here and have it ready, willing, and able. Players aren't going to know what's there. They might see some of the monsters, and therefore when I announce them, that's in the initiative order. But the problem with this is also something you're keeping track of more. It's right in front of you, and you have to ensure that you give that shout out of who's next right away. It requires you to focus a little bit more on that. Now, you could replace that with a visible list. Visible list would be something like on a whiteboard. Whiteboard where people would write down their names and their initiatives on it, leaving some space for you to insert things. Then, when a monster would act, you'd insert it in the initiative, showing it off. This is a way that it can kind of show it off. It might require some erasing, depending on how many monsters you're adding into areas, and some tweaking. An improvement on this would be if you're using magnets where you write names of people or monsters on them, because then you can just move the magnets around, and you could have prepared the monster magnets ahead of time, that you can just pull them out and be like, whack, that's where the monster is in the initiative, here's our order. This is a little better for people on their own to plan out their turns. They can see when they're coming up and when they have to sort of formulate what they're doing something at. It gives them that visual clue. Alternately, though, you can actually give whatever list, whether it's a written list or a whiteboard list, to one of your players and have them track it. And effectively, you just tell them where to insert the monsters at the point in time. You're like, here, insert this monster here, or write down that there's monster A right in there. And then it removes some of that work for you and pushes it onto one of your players, which sometimes you get players which are more willing to do this. Other times you get players who are not going to be happy about that, so you're going to have to kind of judge the types of players you have. And if one would be willing to help you out in this case, it does remove a little bit of work on your end, which always helps. Now, the last way you could possibly do it, which is a kind of in-between way, is index cards. Now, all the players get index cards, and you create index cards for the monsters. Everybody rolls initiatives, you write the numbers on there, then you pick them all up, you put them all into a pile, and you can probably just put the pile right down there on the thing. This gives an opportunity. Now, yes, if you have a secret monster you're going to be sneaking in there, you probably will want to just basically have the number ready, be ready to put it into the pile. But you can see who's coming up, and once it goes, their card moves to the bottom of the pile, and then we see who's coming up next on the top of the pile. So they keep cycling it out. Oh, it's this person's turn. It goes to the bottom pile. We see who's coming out next. And you can then announce, this person's coming out next. It gives an interesting visual representation of the kind of cycling of turns. This means that though they kind of get an idea where they are in it, they're unsure where the monsters are in the first round of initiative. Though after that kind of first round, they will get an idea where the monsters are in the initiative. So let's talk about another thing that you as a Dungeon Master are going to have to do. Tracking hit points. Guess what? Your monsters are going to be injured at some point in time. Plenty of them are going to die. You have to keep track of what their hit points are. You have to know how much damage they've taken, how close they are to death. And you really want to track each monster individually. This comes down to numbers game then. When it's one monster versus a bunch of heroes, that's easy. I could write little notes on my sheet, maybe I'm watching the initiative on. Or if I have an index card for the monster, maybe I write it there. Maybe I have a note sheet that I'm writing down whatever its hit points are, crossing off as players deal damage to it, slowly ticking it down till it's gone. Let's say I have a group of 3 of the same monsters. The book uses the example of ogres, which is a fine one. We got 3 ogres. Alright, which one is which? Now, for me, as a dungeon master, the way I could tell them apart is, and there's again, great example from the book, distinction. Maybe one has a peg leg. Maybe one has a huge scar over its eye. Maybe one has a bulbous belly that's a lot larger than all the others. So you come up with little physical things that make the ogres unique, that then we could say it's that ogre, or that ogre, and we can separate them out. I could also give them names to match with that I would write in my notes, so it's like Thorn, the ogre in the middle. So if someone attacks the ogre in the middle, players don't know his name. I know his name, and I know that the one that they're talking about is Thorn, and they're trying to kill off Thorn. I keep track of those hit points. This works when we're not working with a miniatures board, because giving a little distinction between them allows players not only to tell them apart, but you to keep track of them. So they know I'm attacking the Ogre B, because Ogre B has the peg leg. I'm attacking peg leg Ogre. Hey, I know which one that is from my notes, how many hit points it has. Now, miniatures does create a different problem, because, well, you could get lucky and have 3 different miniatures. That makes it easy. But let's say I only have 3 of the exact same miniature. Well, then I have to do something else. I could use little stickers with perhaps different colors on them or letters on them to tell them apart. I could have stickers A, B, and C and be like, A, B, and C, put it on the 3 miniatures and mark which one is which. It could be something that I could easily put on there and remove to put onto another monster. It just allows that now the players know, oh, that's Ogre A. Now, I don't have to put out those extra details about those ogres, like special descriptions, like names. I still could, but I don't need to, because we're fighting on a miniatures board, and they're beginning to recognize the difference between them, the A, B, and C, and I can then track their hit points over here and see, oh, A is dying, B is not dying, C is also dying. The important thing here about hit points is your players may ask, how's it looking? How's it looking is a very classic thing for players to ask you about a monster. They want to know how well they've been beating it up. An easy thing to think about here is if a monster reaches about half of its hit points, it's getting wounds, injuries, it's starting to get beat up, that you call almost bloodied. And at that point in time, you could say, hey, the creature's looking a little beat up, a little ragged, a little bloodied. The words you actually use, you don't have to use bloodied if you don't want, but you can describe that at half health, it's looking like you're making progress. It's looking like they're getting to that point in time that you might have that victory, might have defeat. And that's a good way of judging how tough a monster is sometimes in the players' minds. Is it that tough? Maybe not. Players don't know that maybe they've been doing just attacks that's resistant to the entire time, and there's got big weaknesses they could have been using that they have not been exploiting. So, that could be a case that could come up. Now, conditions. Now, there are a lot of things that cause conditions, but there are also times that you may want to give conditions on the fly. For example, if your players are one of your players is sleeping and an attack occurs while they're at camp. Hey, one of them has the unconsciousness. Or if a player trips, they're prone. The creature might attack in that kind of moment of weakness. It's like, oh, tripped, pounce. These are more improvising when a condition is placed, but there are a lot of times where specific abilities of both players and creatures will mention conditions are given. For your monsters, it's pretty easy to track conditions. If a player gives one, I can either make a note in my notes where I have the hit points of the card, or if I'm doing something like the whiteboard, I could write, or I could kind of either write on the whiteboard or put a magnet out with that creature, this also works on players, marking their condition. Same with the index cards. But it's easiest for monsters. When it comes to players, the thing is, it's hard for them to keep track of their conditions, and a lot of times they want to kind of ignore them, because it's a negative kind of thing. Not on purpose, may I note, but players try to, put that kind of thing out of their minds as just an instinct, because it's a negative, and they don't like negatives on their characters. It's just something that they can push against, but it's always going to be a nagging thing there. So a great way of doing that is maybe come up with some index cards or note cards of conditions, and you can then hand them out to players. Make them something like big yellow, pink, green, a noticeable color that you can throw it down in front of them, and they can say, put that over the top of your character sheet. Just put it right there. It could be post-it notes, and you're just boom, post-it note on top of it. They're not going to forget that, hey, I'm prone to start this battle, or whatever problem condition that they have. It's noticeable in front of them. So that's a helping hand you're going to give to players. Is what you want to do. Helping hand to your players to keep track of their conditions. Without you having to specifically keep track of their conditions, because it's annoying. That's why you set it up ahead of time, that you can be like, hey, I did a little work ahead of time. I don't have to do work now. Now, just like your players, monsters can score critical hits. Hey, it sucks when it happens to a player, but it can occur. So, most of the time, for monsters, we're of course using the average damage for them. It makes it easier. I don't have to roll. Optional, you can roll. I'm not saying you can't. If you love rolling for monsters, knock yourself out. But we're going to go under the assumption you're using the average damage here. My monster here has rolled a critical hit against my player. What do I do to handle this? I don't have the average damage for the attack set up for just the dice. Well, you roll. You take the average damage, you figure out what dice are from the attack, roll those dice, add it to the average damage. So if my, let's say, monster here did a d6 plus 5, I've got my average damage. Well, let's say it's just got an average damage of 5. Pretty easily. It involves a d6, average damage is 5. So I roll my extra d6, I roll a 2, I add it to my 5, hey, my critical does 7 damage. Is that the most epic critical? No. But I could have rolled a 6 and done a massive and powerful, 11 damage. That would have been the big critical. It's not doing a lot of damage anyway, so with the average damage of 5. But still, this is an example of how you would handle a monster critical. Yes, it involves dice roll then. But because the fact that you're not criticaling a whole lot, 1 in 20 chance, you're probably not going to have to worry about too many extra dice rolls on your end as the DM. That's the point of a lot of average damage and stuff. Makes it easier for you. Now, there can be many cases where you're playing through a game and something occurs to your characters that you have to, improvise the damage that they're taking. Some kind of attack, some kind of natural hazard, some kind of accident. Something occurs that your players will take damage that is beyond a normal monster that you're gonna have to figure it out for. There's a handy chart in the book that gives you an idea based on the number of dice, from a d10 to 24 d10, what kind of attack it is, and, match to that damage. That this kind of thing does a d10. This kind of epic, ridiculous thing does 24 d10. Now, the damage severity and level chart is the next thing you're going to have to look at, because you're matching with the damage that you're improvising with the kind of thing your players can incur. Effectively, I look to the level of my characters. That's the first thing that's going to tell me how many dice it's going to be appropriate to encounter them with a damage that's a improvised setback in a way. Because that's the basic one that players are going to get. A setback. A setback is probably not going to kill anybody unless you're really, really weak. Most of the time, a setback is just going to be kind of annoying, injuring to you. It's going to be something minor, and it maybe pushes you into a position that you're weakened against something else. Hey, something happened. I'm weaker. Now when I encounter the next monster, it might be able to beat me because maybe that 5 hit points I needed, it's gone. Next, you look to dangerous. Dangerous is a little worse off. Dangerous is made that if your characters are injured, it might kill them. This is something that your average character could live with, that if you're in full health, you're fine, but it's going to reduce you to such an area that you're pretty weakened, you're not in great shape, and it only takes a little bit of injury to then kind of knock you down when a dangerous situation occurs. It makes it a little bit more harrying problem to encounter such a thing. This is when the potential of the encounter and the improvised damage you're doing should add a level of deadliness to it. When it was just a setback, probably it's not going to kill. The chances are very rare on a setback. This one, a little bit higher. And then finally you have deadly. It's just that. It's deadly for whatever type of character you are, whatever level you should be. It's meant to be something that could probably kill you. It's meant to reduce you down to 0 hit points. Drop you down. And if you are already injured, even the most powerful characters, if they're already injured, it has a very good chance of just outright killing you. That's the potential of deadly. And so you have to figure out what this falls under. What kind of dice it's going to fall under, one of these. And it gives you an idea between level, the severity, and then the dice you're improvising. How you should handle this in response to your players encountering it. Because if it's going to be something more minor than that, it's just you're being a dick at that point in time. Like if you're talking about 20th level characters or 19th level characters even, and you're just doing a D10, it's nothing to them. A D10, whatever kind of hazard it is, why are you even bothering? You're just being kind of like petty at that point in time. What you want to do is if you're improvising some kind of damaging hazard, make it appropriate to one of these. If it's a setback to them, cool, make it feel like a setback instead of just a petty slice. Now the next thing we're going to worry about is areas of effect. Because the fact is, there are a lot of spells or special abilities that affect an area, whether they are caused by your characters or the monsters that they are fighting. Plenty of them have abilities that just affect an area and may affect multiple targets. And even if we're talking on a miniatures board with a grid, it can still be hard to adjudicate that, let alone if we're just using the, theater of the mind and trying to figure out where everything is in an area. There can be such difficulties in figuring out, is that being targeted? Is that being targeted? Is that not being targeted? Did I get all of these? You can make this a very much so easier task. What we can do is there is a handy chart in the DMG, the targets in area effect. This talks about the type of area it is. We first look to the type of area, whether it's a cone, it's a kind of blast out that has a radius, it's a cylinder, whatever kind of shape your spell takes on. You take that number and you look at the chart, and that chart will effectively take some kind of version of the area and divide it by a number. Once it's divided, it basically then tells you, hey, that's how many creatures you can target with your spell. Now, this isn't this is the end-all be-all. This basically says that this is the number I can target with my spell. So if my cone could maybe only target 3 characters, if I did my math correctly here, that's the maximum it can do with when I'm putting the area out. This is a great way of effectively telling, hey, this is a number of targets I can hit. Now, we kind of look to the next important number with this. And this is kind of a reasonable thing we're talking about. This is doing reasonable math to figure out the number of targets. And assuming that you kind of maneuver yourself, throw your ability where it can do appropriately, things like that. You don't necessarily stick to this. You do affect this a little bit. You first then look to whatever the targets are, whether the targets are the monsters and your players are targeting them, or your players. Are they clustered together, or they spread apart? If they are clustered together, you roll a d3, which usually can just roll a d6, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in that order, and do it that way, and add it to there. That's the maximum of targets you can now get if they're clustered. If they're spread apart, subtract it. Minimum 1. It could mean that they're so spread apart that whatever spell I'm doing, I could still only target 1. That could be the case. And this is a great way of telling that. So then you can get an idea of, oh, I can target 2? I'm going to get these 2. I can specifically choose the ones I'm targeting then. If I've done this math correctly, very quickly and efficiently, we no longer have to do about, some positioning and messing around with it. We just simply, utterly, completely did the math, just made it simple, made it easy. That's very helpful. Again, this is assuming that we're reducing some of the nuances of combat. This is more simplistic, and you can use this with miniatures, but if you really want more exacting numbers, stick to the miniatures, and it's a lot easier to do the math and numbers on the miniatures than it is to do in the theaters of the mind. This is much easier to do theater of the mind. You can still use it in miniatures, that's just fine, but miniatures should be able to do on your own, theoretically, without only sometimes problems. But anyway, that's it for today. So today we talked about combat. Use the DM running the combat, how you run initiative, keeping track of hit points, a lot of different things that you're going to have to keep track of. That's the important thing that you have to think about here and what we're talking about. Because combat, when we talked about running as a player, we talked about how all the things you have to do as a player. Dungeon Master's a lot more. You have to keep track of so much more, have all this information in your head, be ready to handle it perfectly and utterly. Granted, you're probably not going to be perfect. You want to prepare as if you're going to be perfect, and when, of course, you inevitably fail, hopefully because you prepared a lot ahead of time, it's not as bad as it could be. Little things are going to go wrong here and there in the course of combats, that you're going to make little mistakes and stuff. It's just how you're going to mitigate all of them and keep the entire battle flowing. The flow of the battle is what's going to be important here. Anyway, hope you're having a great day. In the next week, we'll be handling more of the combat. But if you've had any interesting encounters, that your DM has used interesting techniques, or you as a DM have used any interesting techniques when it comes to combat that either makes it easier for you or makes it more interesting, just little techniques for the management of the combat, let me know. I'd love to hear about in the comments below. And of course, remember to check out all my links in the description below. My Twitter and Discord are great places to reach out, know what I'm doing, and contact me. You can always check out my Twitch page to see all my live streams where I do video games, and of course, D&D live streams you can catch. And always check out my Patreon. Great way to support the channel, support the work I do, and keep me going so I can do more videos like this. Anyway, hope it's being a great day for you, a wonderful day. And until the next time, I bid you farewell.